Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone. We're going to start on our next session here, which is Mapping Washingtonia, Greek's First Refugee Settlement. And this presentation is a collaborative effort between Harrisburg University, Messiah University, and Franklin and Marshall College. So I'm going to turn over the microphone to David Pettigrew, a professor from Messiah University, and he can start the presentation and tell you more about the participants. David?
All right, good to be with all of you this afternoon. Thanks so much for staying for our session. We have a pretty exciting session here today, I think. GIS in a lot of different capacities. We have story maps. We have the use of GIS to make archaeological discoveries. We have documentary work in GIS, and we have a little fun Greek American history. We won't take too much time on that, but we're going to take you back to Greece's first refugee settlement. I'm professor of history and archaeology at Messiah University. I'm joined today by Professor Albert Sarvis, who's here at Harrisburg University, Kelly Gainey and Alex Shahigan, who are public history majors at Messiah, and then Brooke Rhodes, who's a geospatial technology student here at Harrisburg University. Our colleague at Franklin and Marshall, Kostis Karelis, could not be here today. So what we'll be talking about today stems from a 3-week field intensive last May to June that brought together specialists in archaeology, geospatial technologies, and public humanities and public history. We spent 3 weeks in the Corinthia in the center of Greece. I'll show you a map here in a minute. In part, we were introducing students to the history and archaeology of Greece. In part, we were actively engaged in new research questions. In part, we're trying to do public history, trying to tell a story about a moment of Greece's history that was particularly important. We brought 3 universities together, Franklin and Marshall. You heard Messiah University and Harrisburg University, and 16 students. And there we all are, gathered on the upstairs loft of ancient Corinth. We also worked with local organizations. We partnered with Michigan State University's excavations at Isthmia on the isthmus, and also worked with local historians, people who knew the area really well. Our work this last summer, okay, here we are in Greece, and before I go there, that is where we were based. Ancient Corinth is a little village. It's near New Corinth, and we were working right there on the Isthmus of Corinth. The isthmus, as you can see, is the very heart of mainland Greece. And why is this important? Because every moment of Greece's history, there's an important event that happens on the isthmus. Our work came out of the Eastern Corinthia Archaeological Survey, 1998 to 2003. And during the process of surveying this region back 20 years ago, we discovered a curious settlement called Washingtonia. We actually didn't discover it, but we learned about this settlement's existence, founded by a man named Samuel Gridley Howe, who founded it right near that village of Eximilia. And if you look at that photograph right there, you can see the archaeological survey we were doing. And Albert Sarvis and I partnered with Kostis Karelis beginning in 2017 to try to study Washingtonia as part of the historic landscape characterization. So, have any of you ever heard of Washingtonia before? Probably not, right? It's a curious moment in Greece's history, and so to tell you about that, we have to take a step back and ask, why was Samuel Gridley Howe working with the Greek government to found a colony for the poor? So we have to go all the way back to the 1820s. Greece today was not the same, right? The country is different. It's changed over time. Greece 200 years ago was part of the Ottoman Empire. And right about the time that Americans are revolting and having their own revolution, 50 years later, the Greeks decide, we have been subject to the Ottomans long enough, and we too want our independence. They've been inspired by Enlightenment ideals. They've been inspired by the French Revolution, by the American Revolution. And so the Greeks revolt against their Ottoman lords. And what follows is a very ugly and gruesome 10-year period of war, violence, horrific loss of life. And what's curious about all this in the early 19th century is that French, German, Italians, Americans rushed to the cause of the Greeks. People who had grown up reading Homer, who had grown up reading Thucydides, who knew Greek history from their history books, and thought, here's a moment to support Greeks in their quest for freedom. And these people are called Philhellenes. Now, one of those Philhellenes was a particularly ambitious man by the name of Samuel Gridley Howe. He becomes a very famous person in the course of the 19th century in America. He's a philanthropist. He's well known for his philanthropic activities. He's a physician. He has a doctorate degree from Harvard University. He founds the Perkins Institute for the Blind up in Boston, and the most famous pupil out of that institute will be Helen Keller. He's also married to Julia Ward Howe, famous suffragette. Julia Ward Howe, you may know because she wrote the lyrics to Battle Hymn of the Republic. So this is a famous family, but in his younger days, he had this itch to help the Greek cause. And so he goes to Greece in 1825. He fights in the war. He writes a book about it 3 years later. And in the process of fighting this war, he discovers just the atrocities. People have lost their homes. Atrocities on both sides. Greek soldiers, Turkish soldiers, people have lost their homes. People are starving. There is a tremendous humanitarian crisis. In the island of Chios alone, 20,000 people have been displaced. We've got major displacement. And people like Samuel Gridley Howe and other Americans who joined him came back to the US and they raised money for this humanitarian crisis. And Howe returns with all this money raised in Philadelphia and Boston, and he returns with clothing that was knit together by the women of Philadelphia. He returns with grain, with foodstuffs, and he is there to relieve the poor. Now, Howe is a very principled person. And very idealized person. He won't just give the money out. He has 3 principles for distributing aid. First of all, you have to be very, very poor. And he judges people, are you truly poor or are you just kind of poor? All right, so that's criteria number 1. Criteria number 2 is he makes people work for food. He never gives out the American aid just charitably. He puts them to work. And third, he's aiming for self-sufficiency. So he wants these communities to eventually become self-sufficient and free themselves. When he's on the island of Egina, for example, there off the coast, you can see, on Egina, he meets refugees, people who have been displaced from their homes from Athens. He meets refugees from Chios, and he meets refugees from Ivala. He puts the 600 poor people in Egina to work to rebuild their harbor, and he has in mind to build an orphanage. And while he's there, he conceives of this idea to found a permanent colony of the poor on the Isthmus of Corinth. And so he writes to the new governor of Greece, Ioannis Kapodistrias, and he asks for permission, and Kapodistrias says yes. Okay, so when Howe arrives in Corinth in 1829, there's actually a diary entry on the left, and you can see Corinth there. He finds the city totally in ruins, destroyed by brigands, destroyed by Greek soldiers, by Ottoman soldiers. But if you look there at the bottom of the screen on the map, you'll see that little village of Hexamelia. And he comes to Hexamelia right there, where the arrow is. And he has this little note. He said, we rode to Hexamelia, a ruined village about 3 miles from Acrocorinth, nearly in the middle of the isthmus, which is there 6 miles across. The land is good. It's advantageous. There's a stream through it. This is probably where the canal is going to run eventually. And he said, I immediately asked for 5,000 stremata from the Greek government, 2,000 acres of land on which to plant these these poor families. He returns to Egina, and he works with these colonists over the course of the next year, and he and a number of collaborators work to found the people. Okay, so that's the history lesson there that I had to give you for the background. Now, when we first started looking for this lost colony, it was actually harder than you think to find. Washingtonia is the name that he gives this colony, named after Washington, D.C., because he imagines it's going to be a great new capital. But it was actually hard for us to locate this because although we could associate it with a village called Eximilia, we learned that there were 2 or 3 villages of that name right in the same location. We also recognized and studying the GIS, as Albert will talk about and some of the students will talk about, that the villages change over time, right? They're not stable, static entities, so that's a complication. So it was not actually that easy. The third thing is that the colony itself spread from Eximilia all the way down to Kenkrai, so it's not entirely centered. So we were really at a loss for where to locate this. We knew it was near that Eximilia until we were given a copy of this map. And this is basically, this is a famous map made by the French, the map Pierre Pétier in 1831. And here is an archival copy of the first draft of that map. And that is really detailed. And this was really helpful right away because once we were able to see this, we got much better detail and resolution on those settlements. So we're able to pinpoint the locations of the settlements much better. We discovered there off to the right that Pétier had labeled the magazine, the storage facilities there at Kenkrai, which is really, which corresponded well with what Howard said in his journals. We discovered little chapels that were in place in the 1820s, so contemporary chapels. And then remarkably, this was just what got us so excited, on the map were 2 labels, English House and Hospital. And that got us really excited, and that was how we began the season. So I'll pass the mic on to Albert to take us the next step.
Thank you, David. One of the interesting things we tried at one point, textual evidence from his journal said that from my balcony, I can see both bodies of water, right? The Gulf of Corinth and the Saronic Gulf. And we were doing viewshed analysis, like where could this possibly have been? All these sorts of things. This map really was the missing key, right? It's like in a movie, really. So one of the things that Harrisburg University and the geospatial side of things is we wanted to go over and help map these areas. We've been doing this 2 separate trips, 2017 and 19 or 18, whatever it was, mapping with drones high-resolution imagery of this landscape, right? Landscape that, as Dr. Pettigrew already mentioned, has been changing dramatically over the last 200 years. And so it was important for us to go out and capture this high-resolution imagery because it really doesn't exist otherwise. However, those first 2 years were sort of the Wild West in Greece, and now there are rules. And so I had to, go through the European Aviation Safety Administration and get licensed to fly in Greece. Which, by the way, you do that through the EU, and everything in Greek was in Greek. So I couldn't do it there. So Ireland, being the only English-speaking EU country, is where I am now registered as a EU pilot through the EASA. So that was we discovered this. It literally went into effect at the end of January of this year, end of December of last year. And so I had to go through that training. The drone you see on the right is the one we use primarily in the region. It's a multispectral. It's the Mavic 3M. And that's our Irish registration. It's actually in the EU, your drone is registered to you as a person, so they don't have unique registration numbers. Just a little bit of tidbit of information. So in addition to that, every single flight, anybody do drones here, ever use the Lance authorization, you just automatically, right? Well, all of these had to be submitted 2 3-page PDF, lots of details of every flight we wanted to do, the date we wanted to do it, and a detailed map of where we wanted to fly. So we had to prioritize based on some of these map evidence that we've already talked about, where we wanted to submit to fly, what days, how we were going to do it. So there's a lot of logistics planning went into the process. And so we started compiling all this in ArcGIS Online. So that compilation, right, so there's the base map, but we started adding new information. The Pétier map that Dr. Pettigrew mentioned is a small sort of brownish one there in the middle. Another map of the entire isthmus. And then what's really interesting and was really helpful for land use categorization that you're going to see in a little bit was the British Air Force aerial photos from World War II. Showed details of that landscape from, 80 years ago, roughly, overlaid with the areas we were going to fly. So as we zoom in and we go to where that Howe house was supposed to be, we can already see that sort of curved hillside where the house was located up on a bluff. And so that's what it looked like in, 1942, 43, something like that. Big German influence in that area, obviously still important even in World War II. So there's the Petier map. The house, the English house, is listed on there along with the hospital that he had set up, along with all the other layers. And we built this into, there's the detailed map where that house is. We built it into ArcGIS Online using field maps, Esri's field maps application. And that actually shows the drone flight overlay where we actually flew at the house. So in field maps, there it is, right? Same stuff you just saw in the base map in ArcGIS Online with all our flight areas, all the different layers we could turn on and off. So one day, just touched on the map. Where's the American house? Clicked on it. In field maps, you get directions. Gave us directions, 10 minutes to the house. You have arrived. And we had arrived. Now, we didn't actually find it that way. There's another story that somebody will tell in a bit. But that's how we got there, right? Once we knew where it was, we just touched the map, and the field map in our hands took us to something that we had not known where it was for 100, 200 years. So really kind of cool experience. And as we traveled around, we would use that map and that field maps to guide us to some things. So Dr. Pettigrew mentioned the sort of old historic churches, the chapels, that's there on the left, the Ottoman Tower there with Dr. Pettigrew in the top right, and another area that we went to. So we used all these tools to navigate around the country. So I'm going to hand off to one of our Messiah University students to talk about the actual discovery.
Thank you so much. So being a part of the discovery was definitely life-changing. We had gone out 2 days prior with 2 separate teams of students, and because only so many students can fit in a van, we had to break down into smaller teams. And so we went out on a Monday, and then we went out on a Tuesday, and then I think it was like Wednesday morning, we left at like 6 a.m., 6:30, because it was our last chance to fly in this area. And so we gathered the people who didn't get to go on those first few trips, and we're like, okay, get in the car, we're going. And we followed the GPS location to that general area, and so we started doing a drone flight. And then Dr. Pettigrew and Dr. Corellius had this hunch, this inkling, and they just wandered off in a direction, and we're all watching them go, like, where do you guys think you're going? And so about 20 minutes, 25 minutes pass by. We're still watching the drone as it's going back and forth, making sure we don't lose sight of it. And we see them coming back with the biggest grins on their faces. And we're like, what's up? And Dr. Corellius goes to us, he's like, we found it. And it was jumping for joy. We were sending texts and phone calls to everybody who was back at base camp, who by this time it was about 7 a.m. So people were just waking up, getting breakfast, and they're all sitting at the table and they're getting this text saying, we found the house, we found the house. And everyone at base camp was like, man, and we're here. They're out, they found the house and we're here. We got to sleep in, but we're here. And so let's see. All right, will that play? Or will that? Just don't have to go outside for? Okay. Actually, I'll just try to click it. Okay. So as this is loading, this video was taken at the Howe House location, and when we were there at the location, we started to find artifacts, shingles, tiles, remnants of a foundation and a house. There in the red is Nick Barnes. He has since graduated Messiah at this point, and Dr. Pettigrew, and they're talking about the configuration of where this artifact could possibly be and would have been used for. All that gray plantation that you see there, that's a very sharp plant called Fragana. It is the bane of our existence, and it guarded everything on that house. I'm still finding prickers in my socks from those plants. But it was very, very cool to see something that we've found via drone, to then actually walk up to it and touch it and be like, this was here. We know it's here. And that's really what kind of gets us to the point where we are now. back to you.
Thank you. So we wanted to get that high resolution imagery of that particular area. And so this was a large drone flight. The nice thing is the first year we went over with Phantom 2, Phantom Advanced, whatever it was, and we got maybe 15-minute flight times. We were able to fly for 30, 40 minutes, not quite 40, and map something like 30 to 40 acres per flight, which was great. And then even did lower resolution. So yeah, that's the house, right? Okay, you're all expecting to see something far more exciting. But you can kind of make out a rectangular shape there. And on the ground, I'm no archaeologist, but I could tell there were cornerstones and other pieces of evidence that their home had been there. So really kind of cool to be able to go and get that high resolution imagery. And so this is just a higher shot of it, but we did a lot of work around it. So I'm going to hand off to Alex, one of the students from Messiah, to talk about some of the land use stuff we did.
Yeah, thank you. So I was working a lot on the back end of things. As was mentioned earlier, Amelia is a changing landscape. And for us, working with the historic aerial photos from the 1940s was a really cool halfway checkpoint to kind of see how some of the buildings and agricultural uses of the land had evolved over a little over 100 years. So I went into GIS Pro and just took those aerial photos and just started plotting buildings. And once we got all of those plots up, we made a feature layer with that, and we were able to compare that with both the older map from the 1800s and the present day drone footage, and really see how there are a lot of buildings that just don't exist anymore. There are buildings that had additions added onto them, and really kind of build that narrative of continuity and change for this particular area. And then I went back working with the same data and plotted agricultural usage. So to give you a little bit of background, this is during World War II, and at that point, both Britain and Germany had a very strong interest in controlling the canal that cuts through the isthmus. So there was a lot of military presence in the surrounding area, and as a wartime community, Amelia had to adapt. So the evidence from the aerial photos shows that a lot of land was repurposed for growing grain and sustenance crops to really feed and meet the needs of this wartime community. A very few export crops like olive groves, citrus trees, and this was really striking to us because it's fundamentally different from both the historical data we have about the crops grown in the 1800s during the time of Washingtonia and the present day data from the footage that we took while we were over there. So now I'm going to hand things off to Brooke, who will talk a little bit about the modern land usage.
Thank you. So with Alex digitizing the British World War II aerial imagery, I was tasked with digitizing the modern agricultural land use. So I basically just used Esri's imagery base map for the digitizing, and then part of that was, so not only were we tracking the agricultural land use, but my part was also to look at the distinctions in the crops that were there. So most of the distinctions could be made really just from the imagery, and that's basically because 60% of all of Greece's land use is olives, and they're the most distinguishable crop out of what we're looking at. So obviously we still needed to do some ground truthing to validate our distinctions, as well as look at other stuff that we can't really distinguish. So that's where we essentially had a few points of interest marked down, and Professor Sarvis drove us, and then I just sort of took notes and pictures on the area. You can see here, it's sort of a dense, lighter green foliage, and we can't really tell what that is from the aerial imagery. So validating in the field, we found that that was a root vegetable. So these distinctions, it's part of an ongoing project. So it will be used for later classification and categorization of the crops there. So some of the questions the important questions that we can ask, specifically looking at the aerial imagery in order to make distinctions is, what's the orientation of the crop? Is it random or uniform? The hue, obviously, if it's a lighter or a darker green or a tannish color. We can make distinctions based on that. And then the spacing is another thing. So particularly with the citrus and olive crops, the olives take 10 years for them to reach the maximum fruiting potential. So, and they also get a lot larger. So found that, you can actually see right here, that's all olives, but these are more mature plants. And then above that are these smaller like saplings. So they still have the same spacing and orientation, but obviously have a different appearance. And this area, that's a citrus grove. So that was one of the harder crops to distinguish because it looks a lot like olive groves in the orientation as well as the spacing, but obviously has a much lighter green color. So then validating that in the field, this is just a citrus plant, and then the grove is behind it as well.
So normally when archaeologists, when archaeologists discover sites like we did this summer, they do some basic reporting, right? You go and you present at conferences, you collect feedback, you may turn it into an article. So in January, some of us will present our discoveries at the Archaeological Institute of America, but we also realized that this project had a lot of good public potential. I mean, after all, archaeologists, American archaeologists in particular, had often gone to Greece in the past, not to study archaeologies of recent times, but to study archaeologies of ancient times, right? Everyone's interested in the Parthenon. Everyone's interested in classical period. And that's great, but oftentimes these archaeologies of classicism ignored or neglected or overlooked the important stories of the recent past. And so as our colleague Kostis Karellis will point out often to us, the refugee experience is an important one for modern Greece. Over and over again, populations have been displaced. And so we've thought this is a good story to tell. This is a story that can have some important social good intel that Americans may not know about, this early humanitarian effort. And so we decided early to create a public component to it and also include local residents. So there we're talking with our friend, Mr. Tsingu in the village of Eximilia, and he has written the major history of Eximilia. And so we will talk now here about the story map. I'll pass it back to Alex.
Yes, so one of the public-facing aspects of our project that we're really excited about is the story map, because it brings the story of the refugees at Washingtonia and the change over time of the landscape of Eximilia to people in a really easily digestible format. So one of the really nice things about the collection feature of Esri story maps is that you can just put a bunch of story maps right together. So that's exactly what we did. We are developing stories that break it down into a few different chapters. We're going to talk about how and his original involvement in Greece and how he and Capodistrius launched the colony. We're going to talk about a little bit over a year span of time when the colony was at its peak. We're also going to touch upon the history of Eximilia post-Washingtonia. So that's with the World War II imagery that we talked about earlier and how it basically moved back into the Greek landscape. And then finally, we're also going to talk about our role as the archaeologists who are bringing some of these key locations back onto the map. So this is a project that's very much still in the works, but we're really excited to use the slide map features and sidecar features to make a location that's unfamiliar to a broadly American audience accessible and digestible, and really tell this story in a way that we haven't been able to previously. So I'm going to pass the mic back to Kelly, and she's going to talk about the other public-facing aspect.
So besides all the archaeology work that we did, myself personally, I'm a documentarian. And so I had an amazing opportunity to capture the story in real time. And so I'd like to present to you our trailer for our documentary coming in January.
It's like 6:30 in the morning. We were doing a drone flight with Professor Sarvis, and Professor Pettigrew and Professor Corellis just wander off. And after we finish, Professor Corellis and Professor Pettigrew come back, and Professor Corellis has this massive ear-to-ear smile on his face, and he goes, "We found it."
We were on the ground for probably 2.5 weeks in the Corinthia, living and working in the region and going out doing drone photography of the area as part of a broader study of the landscape. And then on the other hand, we were using a map to identify places of early 19th century date that could be contemporary with the colony.
It's this balance of presenting what we find, warts and all, with all of the good and the bad attached, while also trying our best as people not to let our biases slip in.
America in 1829 is a very isolated place. It's just won its independence. It doesn't have much of a global presence. So we're excited to share with the general public that there was this kind of ground-up swelling of support for something that happened very far away across over the Mediterranean, funded entirely by citizens without the government, without the military, without any other kind of super agency, and having it succeed and in some way kind of provide a model for later engagements.
There's a story here of the Greeks were suffering, but American coming across a problem and wanting to fix it. And this is a theme we see all over history. And sometimes people believe that the American intervention fixed it, and other times people believe that it just kind of messed everything up more. So there's this really careful balance that us as historians need to take when presenting this information, of not feeding into either of those preconceived notions and just presenting the facts and letting other people make their own informed opinions from what we put forward.
This project has been so much fun and has produced so much for not only me, but our universities and my colleagues. And it's been an absolute privilege to be able to capture an experience like this in real time, especially because for most of us, things like this is what got us into the work and where we are today. And I always wondered, how do all these documentarians just know when something's going to be discovered how are they that lucky? And then I went on this trip and I found out, oh, it is just that lucky. And you're in the right place at the right time with the right people, and it all works out. So for that.
This is just a snippet from my personal story map. You can see the Corinth Canal, and then below that is a video of my snorkeling in the ancient port of Cancri. So I mainly focused on just my experience with the culture and cuisine in Greece for my story map, and being that I'm a fourth-year student in geospatial technology at HU, I have familiarity with the story map, but I've never actually done it for my own personal trip. And I think there's definitely something to be said about the weaving of personal experiences and geographic perspective into the spatial narrative. So I think it definitely helps to preserve the memory of the trip. Like I can go back in months later and all of the minute details that would have been missed from just mere pictures, I can remember easily. Yeah.
Yeah, just to comment on that, right? All the students, I think all the students, even yours, did their own personal story map, had to keep a journal while we're there, what they did. So all those details, as Brooke mentioned. So the best part for me was reviewing all those story maps afterwards, because everybody had the different perspective on the trip. Some things we had to edit before we shared them publicly, but otherwise they were really good. And it's a much richer way of presenting that information, rather than just do a term paper at the end, right? 20 pages of narrative text, maybe some photos. That story map really tells a great story. So we want to open up to questions and discussions. Each of the students sort of had their own quote there you can read as we're entertaining questions. But thoughts? Got Joel already. The story map presenter right before us.
It's on.
So the picture you showed, or the aerial footage you showed right after the house was discovered and kind of looking down, it looks like residential to the immediate south and then Olive Grove immediately above. What were the issues dealing with, private property and people saying, hey, get off my land?
Yeah, the European Aviation Safety Administration rules about flights, right? Private property is still sort of that is a consideration. Most of the time we're flying over maybe individual homes. This was during the day when people weren't out about. Most of the flights, probably 90% of our flights were just over agricultural areas. This particular one, that's a top-down looking straight down on top of the area. But yeah, they were pre-programmed flights. We did occasionally go over top places, but tried to minimize that to the best of our ability. Dr. Pettigrew could probably talk about what the access to that site would be. We have actually since then done some research into the ownership of that particular parcel, not the house to the south. But there's a process there. I don't know if you want to speak to that, if that was part of your question or not.
But. We made it a practice when we were out in the Corinthia to anytime anyone came down the road and asked what we were doing, just to tell them. And I think it helped that I've been doing work in the Corinthia for probably 25 years as part of the Eastern Corinthia Archaeological Survey. So we tell them we are archaeologists, that we're only photographing. But it is something that you don't want to advertise exact locations, or you want to be very careful about that because there's concern that property can be appropriated. So it is a sensitive and delicate issue for sure. And we did contact the owner of the property, but that's about as far as we've gotten so far.
I'll be right back to you.
What are your next steps? Is there like some sort of government agency that you talk to about preserving the ruins that are there now? Are you going to go and do LiDAR flights to really pull out any sort of foundation perimeters or anything?
That would be ideal. Now, what we did not talk about in this presentation is that once we begin to layer the landscape in this way that Professor Sarvis described, we began to discover all kinds of things in the landscape, lost things, ancient remains too. And so I think an appropriate next step would be to ask permission from either the local EFORIA, the local organization that handles archaeological work, ask permission to do targeted LiDAR flight, or to work through the American body over there that handles archaeological work, the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. So, for example, we could apply for permission to do clearance. That would involve contacting the property owner. It would and getting permission for that. It would involve working with the American School of Classical Studies at Athens and also the local archaeological agency. So it gets more complicated if we want to do anything else. But LiDAR seems to be a really good non-invasive next step. So that's what I'm hoping we can do next summer.
Yeah, Harrisburg University now has a Matrice 350 with an L1 LiDAR sensor. The challenge is getting the TB65 batteries over there. I can't fly with those. So we're looking into the logistics of that, maybe even rent something over there. But having a base station established at nearby ISMIA excavation and being able to do those RTK LiDAR flights would be a really great, for me anyway, a really cool thing to do next.
And these surrounding houses, to your knowledge, had no idea that this site was there. Is that right?
No. Although, any archaeological site is goes through these complex processes with multiple phases. So this house clearly has a later 19th century phase that we don't realize. I mean, there are runes on the ground, but if the thing is with archaeologists, they're mostly interested in ancient or older things. So to be interested at all in the 19th century is just kind of stands out. No one wants to study the 19th century in Greece. Here in America, people study 19th century sites all the time. And so there is even a sense in which this site's not really even archaeological. It's an old ruined house, right? So nobody knew it. But our friend in Ex Amelia did show us around and showed us a lot of things that we didn't know were there. So it was really the technology, though, that brought us directly to these places, which we had looked for some of these places forever, using other methods, just walking across the landscape. And it was the technologies, the geospatial technologies in particular, that brought us directly to these places. So we couldn't find them.
So this is all fascinating. What I was very interested in is the correlation or the relationship between the refugees that experienced this place, maybe this house, and what kind of additional work might be done about that, because I think that's where the story has legs to me in our current times, and I'm thinking about the last decade that I know about. I didn't ever think about refugees in the 1800s or 19th century. So just curious if you have any additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that's also the piece that really interests me too. And it's actually kind of a challenge because a lot of the resources that we have from that time period are directly from Hal. So we have his journals, his letters, his experiences, his American perception of the Greek refugees. So you can get a little bit of information there. And we've tried to incorporate that into our story map about how people responded to the different policies he put in place, his work week, the ration system, but it's all through the lens of his vision. So that's something that would require a lot of further research and trying to see if anybody has ancestry that goes back or any kind of oral history that gives the perspective of the colonists and not just the American who wrote about them from his own point of view. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Oh, yeah. Shoot. Just one other tidbit. I forgot to mention when I was kind of giving the background to this whole project that the reason that Kostis Karelis especially was interested in this project and steered us towards Washingtonia was an archaeology of refugees. And this is most of the work that he's done. And so he calls this the archaeology of care, that there's a sense in which archaeologists don't simply have to study the Parthenon marbles and the things of yesterday, but can study human experience, which relates directly to tragedies across the globe today. Yeah, so this is something we're definitely going to continue to work on.
Do we have any questions from online? You have a question? Okay. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no, the story map is not yet published. It is very much a work in progress. Our tentative goal is to have it out for the public by this January when we present on our project in Chicago. And the reason it's not out there yet is because we created a preliminary version while we were still in Greece, but that was before we had a lot of the information about the historical context and about European involvement and humanitarian efforts in general. So we're really taking our time with it because we want to tell that story and do justice to the refugees and not just present a very narrow perspective.
Intersection of social justice.
Thank you very much.
Okay. One more? Who had their hand up? Okay, hold on.
Sorry.
I just wanted to ask, is the Finding Washingtonia, is it a movie or is it like a project of some sort? I'm kind of confused if it's a movie or something.
Yeah, so it's a documentary, which is a movie film project. It's okay. We did a first cut of the documentary right when we got back. I had downloaded all the files while in Greece, and then we got home like Sunday, Monday, and I edited around and finished it by Thursday night. And so to me, that was rushed. And so when we were able to reopen this project and to continue it, I knew there were things that I missed that I wanted to continue that added so much more to the story. And so as of right now, the first cut was like 11 minutes. The final documentary will most likely be a half-hour feature. Thank you. Well, that's what I'm going for. So I appreciate that.
Thank you guys so much. A great presentation. And I think you guys will still be around outside if anybody has some individual questions for them. Oh.
The question was, will you be publishing a Greek version of the story map or of the documentary?
It's on.
Okay. So Greek translations are, I personally don't speak Greek, even though we had some lessons. We do have some sections of the documentary that was in full Greek conversation between locals. And so I worked closely with Kostis Karelias to have English subtitles for that section and have a Greek section. In a perfect world where I had money and time and the knowledge to really understand the Greek language, it would 100% fully be in Greek. Maybe that might be just a personal project for like 20 years. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm in a very similar boat. Most of the content, at least for the short-term goal, is only going to be in English. But the wonderful thing about having an ongoing project that is collaborative in nature is that in the future we can have additional collaborators. We can have community partners who do speak Greek and have a working knowledge of the language. So that is a long-term goal that I would love to see come to a fruition, but that would not be within the next year or two at all.
Thank you. We have a few minutes before the next